Places to travel in Egypt. In this video travel guide, I'm going to make recommendations for all of the places that you should visit when you go to Egypt, focusing on how many days you'll have in country, like my recommendations for a 2-day trip versus a 1-week trip versus a 2-week trip, and also focusing on different cities, like what to see in Alexandria or what sites to visit in Luxor. If you don't know me already, my name is Gus. I started Egypt Adventures Travel because I love Egypt and I want to help more people visit and have amazing trips. You can go to my website, egyptadventurestravel.com, to learn more about how I can help with your Egypt adventure and to see upcoming group tours led by me throughout Egypt. Now in this video, I'm going to cover just places to visit, and aside from a couple of little recommendations, I'm not going to be talking about restaurants or places to eat. If that's something that you would like to see a video guide for, drop a comment and let me know. I'd be more than happy to make a video going over my favorite restaurants in different cities throughout Egypt. Before we jump into the video, there is a blog post that goes over everything this video is talking about, including links to all of the places and then relevant YouTube videos. Like if I've already done a YouTube video on a place, that'll be linked in the blog post. The blog post is in the video description, so make sure to check it out and you can use it to follow along with the video and to read more and learn more about these places that I mention. Now let's jump in and talk about places to visit in Egypt. I'm going to start out by making recommendations for trips of a specific time duration, so like a 2-day trip versus a 1-week trip versus a 2-week trip, and then I'm going to talk more about specific cities later on in the video. So to start, for travelers who only have 1 or 2 days, you're going to Egypt, maybe you have a long layover on your flight to South Africa, maybe you just have a free day or two at the end of visiting for a friend's wedding. Whatever reason, if you find yourself with just 1 or 2 days in Egypt, I highly recommend sticking to Cairo. Cairo is most likely where travelers are going to fly in and fly out of because that's the most international flights of any city in Egypt, and the airport there is the biggest. So focusing on Cairo, I highly recommend, of course, seeing the Giza Pyramids and the Sphinx. The Giza Pyramids are the only remaining wonder of the world, and it's a must for anyone visiting Egypt. The Giza Pyramids are about a 45-minute drive outside of downtown Cairo, depending on traffic, and the Sphinx is in the same complex. So visiting the Giza Pyramids and the Sphinx can take up a good half day of touring, and that's the #1 site to see in all of Egypt. Continuing for a 1 to 2 day trip focusing on Cairo, I next recommend seeing one of the museums focusing on ancient Egypt. Right now, the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square, the old museum as we call it, the one that's been open for over 100 years, this museum is currently the home to the most artifacts for ancient Egypt and the best ones like the Golden King Tut mask. Now, the Grand Egyptian Museum, when that finally fully opens, and who knows when that will be, that would be my #1 museum recommendation. But for now, for a traveler visiting Egypt with just 1 or 2 days, I recommend visiting the Old Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square. The Grand Egyptian Museum is great for folks who want to have a little bit more time at a museum that's modern, but there's not much on display at the moment. And then the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization is a newer museum that's fully open, and it's got 22 royal mummies of different pharaohs and queens, so that's another great museum to visit. So after the Giza Pyramids and Sphinx, I recommend checking out a museum to get some more ancient Egypt. Aside from visiting the Giza Pyramids and the Sphinx and one of Egypt's museums focusing on ancient Egypt, I really recommend going to the Khan Khalili Bazaar and Al Mu'izz Street, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site for all of the beautiful Islamic architecture. This area is over 1,000 years old and has amazing historic buildings, and it's also a great place to get some shopping done, although you'll have to bargain with all the vendors who are there. There's also a rooftop restaurant that I love called Ziyara Rooftop that's in Al Mu'izz Street. So that's another place that I visit all the time in addition to the pyramids and Sphinx and a museum. Another really great site to visit with a 1 or 2 day trip focusing on Cairo is the Saqqara complex. Saqqara is the home to the Step Pyramid, which predates the Giza Pyramids, and Saqqara is so much more than that. There are lots of Old Kingdom tombs that you can see in Saqqara, and in addition to this, there are 2 different pyramids that you can go down into, and in the burial chamber see hieroglyphs on the walls. These are the only pyramids that you can visit that are open to the public in Cairo that have this. So when you go to Giza, you're not going to be able to see hieroglyphs on the walls of the pyramids in the burial chamber, but when you go to Saqqara, visiting the pyramid of Unas or the pyramid of Teti, you'll be able to see hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls. So Saqqara, highly recommend, even if you only have 1 or 2 days in Cairo. And the last place I recommend visiting with a 1 or 2 day quick trip in Cairo is Coptic Cairo. A lot of folks don't know this, but Egypt's population, we don't know exactly how many, but scholars say between 10 to 30% of the population are Coptic Orthodox Christian. And this area of Old Cairo has several 1,000-plus-year-old churches. It has a Jewish synagogue, and next to it, outside of the complex, is the oldest mosque in Cairo. So visiting Coptic Cairo is a must for me when I have travelers visiting Cairo for 1 or 2 days. Coptic Cairo is also totally free. So like Khana Khalili and Moez Street, visiting that UNESCO World Heritage Site and visiting Coptic Cairo don't cost you anything. And the best part about Coptic Cairo is that you can get there really easily from the Cairo Metro, from downtown Cairo. All you have to do is ride a few stops. So that's what I recommend with 1 or 2 days in Egypt, sticking to Cairo and seeing the highlights there. Now, adding on a little bit more time, if a traveler has 3 days or 4 days in Egypt, then I highly recommend getting a domestic flight and nonstop flying from Cairo to Luxor to continue sightseeing. Luxor is amazing. It is an open-air museum that has acres upon acres of ancient Egyptian structures, temples, tombs, so much stuff to see down there. You could spend a week in Luxor, but here are my recommendations if you have 3 to 4 days in Egypt and you're going to spend a couple days in Cairo and then add on some time in Luxor. So with just 1 or 2 days in Luxor, I recommend sticking to the main sites. Karnak Temple is the largest religious complex in all of Egypt, and it is astounding. The hypostyle hall with the massive columns is breathtaking. Visiting Karnak Temple, followed by time on the west bank on the other side of the river to see the Valley of the Kings and Hatshepsut's temple, is usually how I recommend spending 1 day in Luxor. If you have another day that you're able to sightsee in Luxor, I recommend taking a sunrise hot air balloon ride over the west bank. Beautiful. And I also recommend visiting Luxor Temple on the east bank, and on the west bank, visiting Medinet Habu Temple, which is usually not visited by big tour groups, and it's a beautiful, beautiful space. And then I also recommend visiting the Tombs of the Nobles or Deir el Medina Workers' Tombs. These are really unique, and they're going to give you a very different experience than the giant, grandiose tombs at Valley of the Kings. And there also are way fewer people there. The Colossi of Memnon is another great stop to visit in Luxor because this is a quick photo op. It only takes a couple of minutes, but the massive statues are amazing to see in real life. So there's a 1 to 2 day trip, a 3 to 4 day trip. Now for a 5 to 6 day trip, you've almost got a full week in Egypt. It's not quite enough time, in my opinion, to squeeze in a Nile Cruise because you would really have to squeeze everything in perfectly to fit that in. But with 5 or 6 days in Egypt, it is enough time to see Cairo, to see Luxor, and then to potentially add on another city like Alexandria or Aswan. So let's talk about Alexandria. Alexandria is Egypt's second largest city, and it's way in the north of the country on the Mediterranean Sea, which gives it beautiful views of the coastline. Alexandria is really different from anywhere else you'll visit in Egypt because of the Mediterranean coastline, the culture and the food of the city, and also the ancient history that's there. In Alexandria, the city was started much later than other cities in Egypt like Cairo or Luxor. And so the Greco-Roman history that's there is really cool to see because it's unique from what you'll be visiting in Cairo, Luxor, and Aswan. My favorite sites to visit in Alexandria are the Kol Sha'afa Roman catacombs. This is my number one spot to visit in Alex. You get to descend underground and visit a Roman catacombs or a place where they buried their dead. And some of the inscriptions that you see on the walls are awesome. So that's my number one place to visit. There's also a Roman theater ruins. That's the second place I like going to. This is the best Roman theater ruins that you're going to find in Egypt, and it's right there in the center of downtown Alexandria, right by the train station. The Library of Alexandria, not the ancient one that burned down, but the modern Library of Alexandria, was built in the early 2000s, and it's my third recommended place to visit. It's an amazing library with a massive reading room. The architecture and the style of the library is beautiful. And then Kite Bay Citadel is the fourth place I recommend visiting in Alexandria. This is an Islamic citadel that sits on the tip of one of the pieces of land that creates the bay in the Mediterranean, the old part of Alexandria city. And this fairy tale looking castle gives you beautiful views of the sea. And of course, I can't talk about Alexandria without mentioning my favorite fish restaurant, Farag Fish Restaurant. It's family owned and it's amazing. They've got great selection of locally fresh caught seafood. You go to the restaurant, pick out what you want, and then they cook it for you right there, and you have a delicious seafood feast. So that's another really great reason to visit Alex, trying some really great seafood. One of the great things about visiting Alex is it's really convenient from Cairo. It's only a 2.5 to 3 hour drive, so usually you can do it in a day trip. You don't need to move hotels, you don't need to pack your bags and unpack in a new hotel. You can leave your hotel in Cairo around 6:30 in the morning. You'll arrive to Alexandria around 9 in the morning when places start opening. You can do your sightseeing, finish with a really big seafood feast, and then drive back to Cairo and get back by 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock at night. So that makes Alex a pretty convenient destination to visit when you're tacking on 1 or 2 extra days onto your Egypt adventure. Let's talk about Aswan. Aswan is the southernmost major city in Egypt, and it has similar ancient history to Luxor and to Cairo, but the atmosphere of the city is tranquil. The Nile is beautiful. And so if you have 5 or 6 days in Egypt, you're seeing Cairo, you're seeing Luxor, Aswan is a great place to add onto your itinerary. You can get to Aswan pretty easily by taking a private transfer from Luxor. It only takes a few hours driving south. You could also take a local train. So it's pretty easy to get down there if you're already in Luxor. And then when you're in Aswan, you can fly back on a nonstop domestic flight to Cairo when you're done. So Aswan, I love going there for the Nile River. The Nile in Aswan is beautiful. It's the most beautiful place on the Nile River of anywhere that you'll visit in Egypt. The start of the cataracts, giant granite boulders that sit in the river, and all of the little islands around the city are amazing to witness. So one of my favorite things to do in Aswan is to get into a felucca boat and to sail or to ride in a motorboat around the river in downtown, just taking in the scenery. Some other really great spaces to visit in Aswan are the Temple of Isis. This is a gorgeous ancient Egyptian temple that was built on an island, and it's one of the temples that was picked up and moved piece by piece to save it from flooding when they opened up the Aswan High Dam. Another great site to visit is the unfinished obelisk. This is a granite quarry where you can see an actual obelisk that was being built by the ancient Egyptians, or I should say being carved, and then was abandoned when they noticed that it was developing a crack. So it's a really interesting way to see how the ancient Egyptians built these mega structures like obelisks. And the Aswan High Dam, to me, it's not a super interesting site to visit for how it looks or what the place is like, but this historical significance of this dam and how it changed all of Egypt is a really important place to stop at when you're visiting Aswan. There's also a Nubian village in Aswan and a Nubian museum. The Nubian people who traditionally have occupied the southern part of Egypt and the northern part of Sudan, are very interesting to learn about, and modern Nubians are extremely friendly and hospitable, so checking out the Nubian village is another option if you're visiting Egypt's southernmost major city. Alright, so now let's talk about 7 or 8 days in Egypt, what places you should visit, and what you should see. So when you have 7 or 8 days in Egypt, this makes it prime to add a Nile cruise onto your itinerary. When I talk about Nile cruises, my preferred method to cruise the Nile is on a dahabeah yacht. A dahabeah is a smaller boat. They usually can fit between 10 to 16 people maximum. And so they provide a great experience juxtaposed with the giant cruise ships with over 100 people all getting to the temples at the same time. It's so crowded. There's so much noise. They're so unromantic. So a dahabeah yacht, to me, is my way that I always recommend for my guests to travel the Nile River. There's a bunch of different dahabeah yachts that I work with and recommend. You can check out my blog post to learn more about each of those and to see some example videos or websites. But a dahabeah is a great thing to add on to a longer trip in Egypt, like having 7 or 8 days. Dahabeah Nile cruises are all different. Some of them are only 3 nights, some of them are 5 nights, and they give you all of the sightseeing time you need in Luxor, Aswan, everything in between, and also Abu Simbel. So adding a Dahabeah Nile cruise onto a longer Egypt trip is something I really recommend. And of course, large Nile cruise ships are an option. They're usually more budget friendly. They often can be more kid friendly, having facilities like a pool to keep kids busy. So if that's a must for your trip, or if a dahabeah is out of the budget or the schedule, using a large Nile cruise ship is an option as well. Another great place to add on your trip if you have 7 or 8 days, and it's often part of a Nile cruise if you're planning on a Nile cruise, is Abu Simbel Temple. This temple takes an entire day to get down to, experience, and get back, but it's very much worth it. It is a magnificent temple built by Ramses the Great, and the facade on the outside combined with the reliefs on the inside make it a must-see if you've got more than a few days in Egypt. I recommend taking a private vehicle down and back instead of flying, because the issue with flying is usually tourists will fly there and fly back the same day. However, if your flight there is delayed and your flight coming back isn't, this could greatly reduce your time at the temple. Once I was on a tour where we flew and we ended up with only about 45 minutes at the temple because the flight there was delayed, but coming back it wasn't. So I recommend driving because the drive is about 3.5 hours, which when you think about all the rigmarole, going to the airport early, security, waiting for the plane, getting on the plane, flying, getting out, going back through security, the drive is kind of nice to just sit in a bus and nap for that whole time on the way to the temple. And then you're not rushed when you're there. You can experience Abu Simbel in all its glory and then head back to Aswan when you're done to either keep sightseeing, continue on your Nile cruise, or fly out of Egypt. Another common place that I recommend tourists add to their itinerary if they have 7 or 8 days in Egypt is to spend time in Cairo, Luxor, maybe Aswan, maybe a day trip to Alexandria, but then adding on time on the Red Sea. The Red Sea has some great scuba diving, snorkeling, water sports, and relaxing 4- and 5-star all-inclusive resorts to let travelers unwind and relax at the end of their Egypt adventure. And especially for folks who are interested in scuba diving, Egypt has some of the best coral reefs in the world, so visiting the Red Sea while you're in Egypt is an opportunity you should not pass up. For the Red Sea, I think it's easiest to go to Luxor and finish sightseeing there, and then it's only about a 4.5 to 5 hour drive east to get to Hurghada on Egypt's Red Sea coast, or El Gouna, which I prefer to Hurghada, a little bit further north, a purpose-built resort city that is a beautifully manicured fantasy paradise where you'll get there for a few nights at your resort and you won't want to leave. So doing Luxor and then driving to the Red Sea, staying at a resort for a couple of nights, doing some scuba diving, snorkeling, relaxing, and then Hurghada has an international airport where you could fly out to Europe or to the Middle East, or you could fly back to Cairo for your flight back to the United States or wherever you're going after your trip to Egypt. So what if you have well over a week in Egypt? With 9 days or more in the country, here are some other places that I recommend visiting. The Sinai Peninsula is a must for travelers who want to experience more of Egypt than just the hustle and bustle of Cairo and the ancient sites in the south. The Sinai Peninsula has a few different areas that travelers can go to. I recommend Sharm el-Sheikh, the biggest city in the Sinai Peninsula, for travelers who are flying in and flying out because they have a large airport there, tons of resorts, and lots of great access to different scuba diving, snorkeling, and other activities in the area. But my personal favorite is actually going a couple hours north from Sharm to a little city called Dahab. Dahab has a backpacker, bohemian, hippie kind of vibe to it. It's very chill, it's very laid back. The focus in Dahab is on relaxation, scuba diving, and just enjoying the sea and taking a slower pace in life. So Dahab is where I usually like to go. Another place in the Sinai Peninsula that travelers usually want to visit is St. Catherine's Monastery. This is another one of Egypt's UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and it's in the Sinai Mountains, allowing you to visit an old monastery over almost 2,000 years old. And then climbing up Mount Moses or Mount Sinai is another experience travelers love. You climb up the mountain at night and see a beautiful sunrise before you climb down and explore the UNESCO World Heritage Site of St. Catherine's Monastery. Ras Mohammed National Park is another must visit in the Sinai Peninsula, especially for folks who are interested in nature or in scuba diving or snorkeling. I actually went to this park last December and camped at a Bedouin eco lodge where it was a compostable toilet. We slept in a tent right on the water. It was a really, really cool experience. And then exploring Ras Mohammed National Park and looking at all the natural wonders there, like the rock formations or the mangrove beds. And for scuba divers and snorkelers, seeing the beautiful coral reefs. Ras Mohammed is a really great place that I recommend visiting if you have time in the Sinai Peninsula. Other places that I recommend visiting with more than a week in Egypt are the desert oases. Egypt has a rich history out in its western desert, and visiting places like Siwa Oasis, El Fayoum Oasis, and some of the other oases like El Hurghada, Dakhla, Farafra, and Bahariya add a great touch to an Egypt adventure because it gives you a really different experience of life in Egypt aside from Alexandria, Aswan, the Sinai, and all of those other places that I talked about. Siwa Oasis especially, it's really difficult to get out to with an 11-hour bus ride or an 8-hour private vehicle ride. But once you're out in Siwa Oasis, it is a serene paradise and you will not regret visiting it. El Fayoum Oasis is a place I often put on itineraries because it's only a 2.5-hour drive out of Cairo, so it's much more accessible. And tourists could visit El Fayoum Oasis as part of a day trip. So you could go out there for the day, visit some sites out in the desert in a 4-wheel drive vehicle, have a Bedouin guide, have a delicious Bedouin lunch in the desert, and then go back to Cairo at the end of the day. So those are some really great places to experience Egypt's western desert oases. A really quick tack on to a trip in Luxor that I recommend for travelers who have some extra time and who love ancient Egypt is driving a little bit north of Luxor City and visiting Denderra Temple and then visiting Abydos Temple. Denderra and Abydos are amazingly well-preserved temples. They're off the beaten path, so you don't see as many tourists visiting them, and they're super important to ancient Egypt and our understanding of the ancient Egyptians. Tel El Amarna is another place that I highly recommend if travelers are obsessed with ancient Egypt and want to really go off the beaten path. It's next to the major Egyptian city of Minya, which is several hours south of Cairo. It's about halfway in between Cairo and Luxor, and Tel El Amarna is a little bit outside of Minya. I've got a whole YouTube video on it that you can check out, but it's the ancient capital city of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who decided to have a monotheistic religion in ancient Egypt, took the capital from ancient Thebes or Luxor, moved it to this place in the middle of nowhere at the time, and now you can visit that site, go into the tombs, you can visit the tomb of Akhenaten himself. It's a really amazing place for folks who are obsessed with ancient Egypt like me and who want to see all of the major ancient sites throughout the country. And there are so many places that you could still visit in Egypt that I didn't mention in this video, like Wadi Natrun Monastery, or Marsa Alam on the Red Sea coast, or Marsa Matruh on the Mediterranean coast, or Damietta, or El Rashid. So I recommend getting a guidebook. The Lonely Planet guidebook is the one that I've used a ton over the years to look through and do a deep dive of places to visit in Egypt so that you can get an idea of all the things that are out there and you can decide what's best and what's most interesting for you during your trip. With this last part of the video, I want to circle back to some of the major cities in Egypt and add on additional places that I recommend seeing and visiting if you have time. So starting out with Cairo, if you have more than just a couple days in Cairo, I highly recommend visiting some more ancient Egyptian sites. Dahshur is my personal favorite of these more deep cut places to see because the pyramids at Dahshur, there's almost nobody there, and they show you how Egyptians progressed from building pyramids like the Saqqara Step Pyramid to building the true pyramids that you see at the Giza Plateau. Memphis is another great place to visit that gives you some more ancient Egypt. There's a colossal statue of Ramses the Great that you can see. There's the second largest sphinx in Egypt, believed to be of Hatshepsut, and a bunch of other statues and artifacts strewn out throughout an area that used to be one of Egypt's major capital cities. In addition to ancient Egyptian sites, there are some other really great spots to visit in Cairo if you have the time. The Cairo Citadel is a beautiful mosque that sits on top of a plateau, giving you a panoramic view of the city, and the mosque itself is breathtaking. I highly recommend visiting it both for the architecture and also for the view. Ibn Tulun is another great mosque that's just a little ways away from the Citadel and gives you another glimpse into the wealth of Islamic architecture that there is in Cairo. And the Geyer Anderson Museum is an old house that's now turned into a museum and gives you a glimpse into what an old Islamic house looked like. That's another place I recommend visiting that's nearby the Citadel and also Ibn Tulun Mosque. The Cairo Tower is another cool site to visit. It's in the island of Zamalek, right across the river from downtown. It used to be the tallest building in Egypt, and you can go all the way up to the top for a panoramic view of the city. Just don't eat at the revolving restaurant, it's not very good. Another place that I recommend to visit in Cairo is the Islamic Art Museum. This art museum has one of the most important collections of Islamic art in the world, and it's really close to the center of downtown Cairo, so it's easily visited by walking, public transit, or taking a quick taxi or Uber. And then, of course, there's the other museums that I mentioned earlier in the video, the Grand Egyptian Museum and the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. These are great spots to visit if you have more time in Cairo than just 1 or 2 days. If you have some extra time in Luxor and you've already added the Deir el-Medina workers' tombs and the tombs of the nobles onto your itinerary, here are some other places I recommend visiting. The first one is the Ramesseum. This is a temple that was dedicated to Ramses the Great, and even though it's much more dilapidated than Medinet Habu or Karnak Temple, it's still a great temple to visit, and Ramses was such an important pharaoh in Egypt's new kingdom. I also love visiting the Luxor Museum because it's a really compact, well put together museum, and it has some beautiful masterwork pieces of Egyptian statuary that were found in Luxor Temple and on display at this museum. And the museum gives you a great break in the air conditioning if you're visiting Luxor during a really hot part of the year. With some extra time in Aswan, I recommend elongating a felucca boat tour and stopping at different places along the Nile River, like the tombs of the nobles, which are similar to the nobles' tombs in Luxor, Kitchener's Island, which has a botanical garden, Elephantine Island, and visiting the ruins of Abu, some ancient Egyptian ruins on the southern section of the island, and also going to the St. Simeon Monastery, which you can climb up to or take a camel ride. Kalabsha Temple is another ancient Egyptian temple you can visit in Aswan if you have a bit more time. With some more time in Alexandria, I recommend checking out some of the city's museums. The Alexandria National Museum has artifacts going all the way from ancient Egypt up to modern 20th century Alexandria, and then the Greco-Roman Museum was recently reopened and focuses on Alexandria's Greco-Roman history and heritage. Alexandria's Royal Jewelry Museum is a cool spot that's different from a lot of the other sites in the city, and you can see a lot of jewelry that was worn by aristocracy and by the royal family in Egypt back in the day. And then my last recommendation for more time in Alex is visiting Pompey's Pillar. It's a Roman pillar flanked by 2 sphinxes, and then there's also a serapeum on the site as well. So that's my video on tons of different places that you can visit in Egypt with my recommendations for places to visit based on how many days you have in the country and also specific cities. What did you think about the places I recommended? What places would you add to the list that I really need to put on there? What places do you have questions about that I didn't talk about in the video? Leave me a comment and let me know. I love hearing from my viewers. Hearing your thoughts helps me make my content better and helps me find suggestions for what other content to create. So thanks for checking out this video. I'll see you all in the next one.